How's it going, everybody, and welcome to episode 241 of Master My Garden podcast. Now, this week's episode, we're looking at, I suppose, the topic that I've probably covered it most, or I certainly covered it a lot on the podcast, but it's one that the questions just keep coming on it all the time, and it's in relation to wildflower meadows. And the reason I'm covering it now is off the back of a question from a couple of weeks ago as to when is the best time. And the best time is to sow a wildflower meadow is without a doubt September. That's your best month. So I'm going to cover it, sort of the main points in relation to, a wildflower meadow and chat a bit about my one, which I know I've mentioned several times on the podcast before, but we'll chat a little bit about that and it'll sort of give a feel for, I suppose the reasons why I put in a wildflower meadow and how that has maybe changed over the years since I put it in. So yeah, as I say, September the best time to do it. And I suppose before we kind of get into it, it's important to understand what an actual wildflower meadow is. So when you see you see it everywhere. You see it in the pound shops, you'll see it in the garden centers, you'll see this floral, high floral meadow that people sell as wildflowers. And it's important to be clear on what it is that you're buying at the start and what it is that you're looking for at the start. So most people come to this with a look in their mind, and that is that full color, lots of multicolored flowers in it. Generally speaking, just a mass of flower. And there's two ways to achieve that. Number one is with a floral meadow, and a floral meadow is cultivated flowers. So that can be things like cosmos and cornflower, which I know is native in Ireland, but it would be, heavily the mix would be heavily dominated towards the likes of cornflowers, poppies, things that are high flower, a lot of annual type seeds. And you sow them in, typically you sow those in springtime, and then you get a really big flush of flower in year one. And then after that, if it's a mix that has some perennials in it, it will last, but it typically doesn't last very long. So something like that with cultivated flowers in it, you'll get a big flush of flower in year one. Year two will look totally different. You'll have some flower from perennials, but by year two, three, it'll be weakening all the time. And certainly by year four, you'll be redoing it if it's a floral meadow, which has a combination of annuals and perennials in it. Sometimes you can buy an annual floral meadow, and that will be high color, and you'll need to sow it every year in the springtime. And they're really beautiful. Like there's such substantial amount of color in that. You get, huge flower, and they're really beautiful. And it is it's a very good way to add high color to your garden. But again, it's a short-term one. For me, what I chose when I sowed my meadow was a native Irish provenance, Irish sourced, Irish grown seed, and all native plants. And I suppose again, I would have come to it with the main objective being reducing the mowing and having something that looks good at the front and was of benefit to pollinators. That was particularly my thinking. And you would have heard me saying this several times on the podcast, but my perspective and my reasons for choosing that at the start were, as I say, high color, reducing mowing. But now the biggest joy and benefit is from the fact that it's a complete haven for wildlife and particularly birds. And that has been the biggest win. Something that I knew that there would be benefit, but it has been a huge benefit. And the difference, I suppose, with a meadow like this is that it is a long-term project. So it flowers, have all your annuals flowering in year one. I sowed it in May. This is its third year, so it would have been sowed, 3 years ago, 36 months ago, or a little bit more now. And in year one, it was high color, a lot of annuals in it, a lot of cornflower and so on. And then by year two, it was heavily dominated by ragged robin, oxeye daisy. Year three, which is this year, again, ragged robin, oxeye daisy, meadow buttercup, and so on. And later in the year, it changes. And as I look out today, in terms of aesthetic, it is not a nice looking meadow. It looks untidy. It looks like yeah, it's not something that people would like. Recently, we had a family occasion, and we had some part of it here on the weekend, and there was one or two comments about how messy it looked, and it does. And I think that's something that you need to understand, when you're starting this, that it doesn't look high color all year round. A native meadow, and even a floral meadow, you're going to get a real good floral meadow. You're going to get maybe 4 months out of it that it's going to look really well, and then it can look a bit shabby then the rest of the year. A native Irish meadow, you're going to have periods of interest from March right through to September until you cut it. But it's going to look that real high color, that picture postcard type look for probably 2 months. That's kind of your time scale. During those 2 months, it'll change. And then for the rest of the year, it's going to look a little bit untidy. But from my point of view, my perspective now has totally changed. So I actually don't really mind the look of it. I need to cut it now in September for the benefit of the meadow itself, in order to allow some of the other perennials to keep coming through as they have, and so on. And I need to take the cuttings away, which is a little bit of a job. But the biggest thing at the moment is the amount of birds. It's phenomenal. So this morning I was pulling out wheelie bins, and as I came around the corner from the front, there was a group of, at an estimate, I would say 40-ish goldfinches that rose off the meadow. And if you sit inside and you look out, you will see them, like the meadow is kind of bouncing up and down because they're hopping from seed head to seed head. And these seed heads are, they're on small plants, so they jump onto it. The plant bends down like a fishing rod, and then they pick, and then they move to the next one. So you're constantly seeing this kind of up and down movement across the top of the meadow. So that for me is the biggest thing. I've had bullfinches in the garden for the first time since the meadow went in, and it has become basically an ecosystem all to itself. So if you're looking for high color, 12-month round, beautiful picture meadow, that doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in nature. It doesn't exist in the seeds that you sow or in any mix that you'll buy. So you need to be aware of that, so that it is going to look slightly untidy in some people's eyes at certain times of the year, but your benefits are different. So some of you will remember back to one of the really early episodes of the podcast with Sandro Cafola. Now, Sandro is the wildflower expert in Ireland. He knows everything about it. His company produced the seed. A lot of it is handpicked. They sort through seed, they grow seed, they contract grow seed, they teach other people how to do it. They supply, county councils, landscapers, and the whole lot. And all of those meadows become ecosystems wherever they're sowed. And, Sandro, in that episode, he speaks about, and it's the second most popular episode ever of the podcast, continues to be listened to so often. And it's the one that a lot of people will come back and say, I listened to that, and it really cuts through all the noise and really, identifies what you need to know in relation to creating a wildflower meadow. But in that episode, Sandra talks about, that fact that it doesn't have color in the wintertime. And his thing on it was, what do you mean it doesn't have color? And you have the bullfinches, the goldfinches, and all that feeding in it. So it's, as I say, it's not the high color all year round, but there's definitely interest for a lot of the year around. So that's the big thing, and that's something to be aware of. So they're your options: floral meadow or wildflower meadow. As I say, I chose a native wildflower meadow, got the seeds from Sandro, and I don't it has been a real addition to the garden. I'll talk about some of the other reasons in a minute. I created a course on how to create a wildflower meadow with Sandro, and that's available now to get, to buy. It's €47. It's phenomenally good, if I do say so. It's great content. So it talks about all of those things, you know, what to expect from a meadow, how to sow a meadow. There's a Q&A with Sandro asking the regular questions. And it outlines everything you need to know about creating a native Irish wildflower meadow. And it really is, you know, I suppose, even if you're, you know, if you're considering creating a meadow, in order for you to have it, to get as good a meadow as is possible, it's well worth investing in. So it's €47 for lifetime access, and I'll put the link in the show notes of this episode anyway. But the big thing with it at this, like, there's several ways of creating a meadow. So the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan doesn't recommend that you actually sow a meadow. It recommends using the no grow or no mow, let it grow formula, which basically means you designate an area, you stop mowing it if you're already mowing it for a lawn, or if you're, you know, trimming it or whatever, you just let it go. And over time, you see what develops out of it. And that's a really good way of doing it if you're in, you know, if you're somewhere where there is a lot of plants that would become meadow plants already there. But if you've been keeping a lawn and maintaining a lawn the way that most people do, in that they're not allowing weeds to develop in it, then you more than likely have been using something to keep out those, so that you only end up with grass. And then if you use that formula of just stopping mowing and letting it grow, what you end up with is grass. The area tends to be high nutrition then, so that means that the grass grows strongly, it seeds, and really in a scenario like that, it's very, very hard to establish anything that would resemble a meadow. Now, if you have an area that is a lawn that is kind of unkept, and you have all these little, you know, like Achilles and all these little plants that are there, but the tops are getting cut off them on a weekly basis as you mow, and they're already there and you haven't been doing anything to take those out, then by stopping, they could actually come forward, and sometimes you can establish a really good meadow that way. But in most cases, here in Ireland anyway, you're not going to be able to do that, because most people maintain a lawn in, you know, in the traditional way of keeping everything out of it except the grass. So that's one way of establishing. Others then talk about using, and it's at this time of the year that you can get yellow rattle, and yellow rattle is known as the meadow maker, and it's a phenomenally good plant. So what it is, it's semi-parasitic. It attaches itself to the root of grasses, reduces the grasses, weakens them so much that other plants can come forward. Yellow rattle needs to be sowed at this time of the year, needs a period of cold to germinate, and then it's an annual, it sets its seed again, and it just continues to, you know, seed and grow and weaken the grass, and then eventually over time you form a meadow in that way, and that's why it's called the meadow maker. And it's a really good way of doing it. The only thing to caveat to that is that it has absolutely no effect on scotch grass. So if you have scotch grass in the area, you use yellow rattle, that'll reduce the, you know, some of the other grasses, and the scotch will just take over. So you just need to be aware of that. If there's scotch there, it doesn't have any effect on scotch. It's used a lot in, you know, old established, or, you know, big houses where they're looking to establish meadows, because there's a lot of softer grasses, and it's really effective at reducing all of those, and eventually you start to get a meadow coming through over time. And particularly in those type of meadows, you'll often see the presence of orchids and all that starting to come through. So it is a really good thing, but just be sure that you're aware of its benefits, but also possibly its limitations when it comes to things like scotch grass. So that's, you know, another way of establishing. But the most effective way of establishing it is to create a completely weed-free seed bed, as you would, you know, if you were sowing a lawn for the first time. And there's loads of ways of doing that, but that's how you go about it. You create a fine tilt, the same as you would with sowing a lawn, and then in September you set your wildflower seed on it. And, you know, that is by far the most effective way of creating a really strong wildflower meadow. So the meadow I have, it's a huge mix of flowers in it, and different periods of interest. So for me, in my meadow, I have a good few bulbs planted into it, particularly things like crocuses, native bluebells. I have some daffodils, recently tried, or last year tried, some camasias in it. small amount of them. They did really well and they were really long lasting and interesting. So there's going to be more of those added this autumn, and that's another reason why I need to do a heavy cut on mine in the coming weeks. So Camassia really well in it, and that gives great looks. So what you end up with is your snowdrops, crocuses, bluebells, daffodils, narcissi. They're flowering early. Along with those, you'll have things like cowslip that's multiplying quite a lot. First year there was very few of them. Sorry, first year there was none of those. Year two there was a few, but they were very small. Year three, which was this spring, a lot of them. So, but still a little bit small. But those clumps are going to be getting bigger all the time. They're going to be setting seed, and over time there's going to be more and more cowslip coming into that, and it's going to look really good at that time of the year. And that's your sort of first period of interest. And in terms of, pollinators, if that's your aim, the bluebells really good for pollinators. So you're getting that early flower for the bees if they come out. There wasn't a huge amount of them around this year. And even on the late meadow, there's actually not that many, again, down to lack of sunlight levels this year, lack of heat. There definitely has been I would say a lot less of them this year, without a doubt. And I see reports of that all across the country. So that's sort of your first block of color. And then the meadow changes, and every so often a flower will dominate for a period of time, and a look will dominate for a period of time, and then it'll change. So for example, the oxeye daisy and the ragged robin, and the meadow buttercup. So oxeye daisy, obviously white, they were quite dominant through May and up into June. There's still some in it now, but they're very dominant in that early period. So you have a lovely white color. And then the ragged robin is a bit shorter, and it sort of underpins it, or it's a little bit below it. So you have that pink and white contrast, and that looks really good at that time of the year. Yarrow then comes through, and then we have a lot of yellows. So sort of through midsummer, you have a lot of yellows, things like meadow buttercup, as I mentioned, through May and June. John's wort. Then you have, I mentioned the primula early in the time. Bird's foot trefoil, that comes a little bit later. Yellow rattle, hawkbit, they're all yellow color flowers, and they all come through at various periods. You have red flowers then, as I said, red pink flowers. So I mentioned the ragged robin. Last year, not so much this year, I had poppies. There's a few in it, but not a lot, and they tend to die out as they would in a floral meadow mixture, because they're not hardy enough to establish there. Knapweed is a big one now that's absolutely adored by pollinators. There's a huge amount of that now. A lot of the flowers are, so there's a kind of a mix. Half the flowers are gone over, half of them are in full flower still, but there's a huge amount of pollinator activity on that. Things like purple loosestrife, that's a really beautiful flower on its own. Things like eyebright, red campion, red clover, and there's kind of these layers within the meadow. And they're all flowering there now. So that's going to get you, between the bulbs kicking off the start of the year right through to sort of September time, where I cut the meadow completely. I have to take away all the cuttings off of, trying to reduce the fertility in that area, take off all those cuttings, and then the meadow will grow again. Some things actually might pop up and flower, depending on how we get on through October. There might be a little bit pops through at that stage. But again, your meadow for the winter time will be green, but there won't be much else going on in it. But that's kind of normal. It's the time of year, what they expect at that time of the year. You're not going to get huge color from natural sort of settings, and then you come into the spring and the whole thing starts again. The benefit of this, of course, is that it's a long-term project. It's not something that, like the other meadow, that you're going to get a year out of, or 2 years, or have to continue doing it. This is basically an ecosystem that you've created in your garden. It takes a small bit of management year to year, taking out things like docks if they arrived in it, or things like thistles in it, so that you don't want them getting established in there. And then you get this yearly benefit to pollinators, to biodiversity, and especially birds. They really go mad for it. So the side benefits of that, as I've mentioned again before on the podcast, is things like the blue tits are in there, and because there's so many blue tits in the garden, then not seeing any caterpillar damage on brassicas at all, because there is just more biodiversity within the garden anyway. So that's a huge advantage, and it's definitely a side benefit of having the meadow. So that's kind of the outline of it. In terms of what needs to be done with the meadow, then it's just a case of yearly cutting, really. It's a case of ensuring that you allow more and more of these perennial flowers to come through. And sometimes it can take 3, 4, 5 years before some of these true perennials, these long-term perennials, will come through. And they're going to be really special when they do come through. Some of the sort of shorter lived perennials, the likes of oxeye daisy, they will probably fade out a little bit. They won't fully die out, but there'll be less of them as time goes on. And then some of the other ones will come through. I see things like wild carrot in it this year. They've sort of come through quite strong. They really reduce the fertility in the ground, and that's the purpose of them in the meadow. And it's a really, really beautiful thing to see that life in that meadow. As I say, it's not for 12 months of the year, it's not that picture perfect postcard type wildflower meadow, but the benefit is far beyond the aesthetic of it. It really is a fantastic look to have all year round. So two things, it's the perfect time of year to sow it, going into September. September is the best month to establish particularly a native meadow. And obviously then being in September, October, bulb planting time. So it gives you that opportunity to do the two things at the same time. So sow your meadow and plant in some bulbs into it. And now you're starting to create for next year, you're starting to create color from very, very early in the year, and something that will be flowering right through all next summer up until you cut it, in early September next year. Now, some meadows, depending on what mix you get, some meadows you might actually do a cut on it in sort of midsummer, early July time, and doing a cut at that stage will result in a second kind of flush of flowers on certain varieties later in the season. The meadow I have, the best time to cut it is just happens to be September. So again, it just depends on what it is that you're doing. If you are considering growing a meadow, as I say, Sandro, you tell him what sort of ground you have, where you're based even, and he'll sort of give you a mix that's tailored for that. So it really is, it's the best way of doing it. And, the course, as I say, it's from start to finish, it just gives you everything that you're going to need. So talks about what we just spoke about, the difference between the two meadows, how to establish it. We look in kind of depth at the various ways of doing that, how you can do it, how you can establish a meadow. We show you how to actually sow it. So we sow a meadow, we rake over a meadow, we show you how to do all of that. We show you the next steps, what to expect as you're starting to get germination. We look at some of the individual flowers within a meadow and the purpose of them within it. And, we talk about all of those things. Then we do a Q&A, and we show you, Sandro growing or sowing and sorting and cleaning some of the seeds in his seed houses. So it's a really, really good, useful course if you're considering a meadow for this autumn. And as I say, I'll leave the link to that in the show notes. Other courses from Master My Garden, so created Master My Garden School, other courses will be added. Next one I'm working on is a container gardening course. So that's, going to be covering everything to do with kind of container gardening, or a lot of things to do with container gardening, and that'll be available sometime over the coming months. So that'll be building it up. So that's kind of three courses then, and going into next year, hopefully add more. And next week's episode on the podcast is a really good one. It's not actually recorded yet, but it's scheduled for early next week. So won't say too much about it in case anything goes wrong, but it's sure to be a good one. It's a really interesting one, something I've been trying to line up for a while as well. So that'll be good. But remember, if you are interested in creating a wildflower garden, wildflower meadow, then September is the best month to do it. And now is the time to start planning it and working towards that. So that's, that's kind of the timing is perfect. So get going now at it, get your seed, get your ground ready, get sowing. It doesn't have to be a big area, and you will see the benefit for years and years to come. We're going to cover an episode coming up as well that's solely dedicated towards bulbs. A request from a listener this week is in relation to forcing bulbs, and I'll cover that in the next week or two as well. And yeah, so there's a couple of good episodes coming up and lots to look forward to over the coming weeks. The weather is starting to get a little bit settled. I was able to go out and mow grass yesterday for the first time. Tomatoes are coming in abundance now, so there's lots of positives around the weather at last this year. So hasn't been too much rain here, even though we've had heavy showers. There's been nice dry days, nice bit of warmth, and hopefully we're going to have, sort of an Indian summer as we go through into September. So yeah, certainly something to look forward to. And that's been this week's episode. Thanks for listening. Until the next time, happy gardening.